The bus rolled quietly along a two-lane highway bordered by pine trees, the late autumn sun slanting through the branches like thin gold blades. Most passengers looked ahead absently, lulled by the steady hum of the engine, but three elderly men near the front leaned forward in their seats with a kind of reverent alertness, as if the landscape outside were not simply forest and farmland, but a memory rising slowly into view. Their jackets were neatly pressed, their silver hair combed back, their hands folded with a seriousness that belonged to another age. These were men who had seen this land before, under very different circumstances. German POWs once housed in Canada during the Second World War. 8 decades later, they had returned, not as prisoners, not as soldiers, but as survivors of a time that lived beneath their ribs. The bus turned onto a main road leading into a small Ontario town. A cluster of cars filled the parking lot of a familiar red and white building. A line of people, workers in reflective vests, mothers with strollers, teenagers in hoodies, stretched out the door. The three men stiffened. Their eyes narrowed in unison. For a moment, their breathing seemed to slow. One of them leaned closer to the window, the ghost of a worry flickering across his face. "Rations," he whispered in German before he even realized the word had slipped out. The volunteer standing near the driver didn't hear him at first. But his companions did. They exchanged uneasy glances. Lines had meant hunger once, uncertainty, scarcity, winter mornings where the cold gnawed at their bones while they waited for the ration ladle to strike the pot. Their minds, trained by decades of memory, did not see a coffee shop. They saw a distribution point. They saw necessity. They saw fear. The bus braked gently in front of the building. Steam drifted from the roof vents. The smell of coffee, warm, sweet, thick, seeped through the cracks as the door opened. The volunteer turned to the group with a cheerful welcome. "All right, everyone, breakfast stop." But for the three former POWs, the sight of that long line outside had stirred something deeper, an old knot tightening inside the chest. When the last passenger stepped off, the volunteer noticed their hesitation. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. One of the men nodded, though he couldn't tear his eyes from the line. They're waiting for food," he asked softly, his German accent still curving the words even after so many years. The volunteer blinked, then let out a small laugh, not mocking, but warm, startled, kind. "Oh no," she said. "That's just Tim Hortons. They're lined up for coffee." The men exchanged glances again, this time with confusion rather than fear. Coffee. This many people. For coffee. Their steps onto the pavement were slow. The morning air brushed their faces, carrying the drifting scent of roasting beans. Something in that smell cut through their tension, the way warmth sometimes sneaks through a crack in an old wooden door. But memory fights warmth. Memory clings. As they approached the entrance, one man's hand trembled slightly, though he pretended to adjust his sleeve. Another swallowed hard. They did not want to appear frail in front of the locals. Inside, the bakery case glowed. Donuts dusted with sugar. Bagels. Sandwiches. A kind of abundance that felt surreal to men who had once counted potatoes one by one. A cashier smiled at them. People stepped aside to let them through. No suspicion in their eyes. No anger. Only curiosity, and something gentler, as if the townspeople understood that the three visitors carried a weight invisible to others. One of the former POWs ran his fingers along the counter's smooth surface. "In the camp," he said quietly, "we used to stand in line early, for bread." His companion nodded. "And for soup." The cashier looked up, surprised. "Soup," she repeated softly. The man smiled weakly. "It kept us warm." The volunteer approached them again. "People here line up every morning," she explained, "because they want to. They're not forced to. They're not afraid of shortages." The oldest of the three blinked rapidly, as if something inside him had cracked. "To choose lines," he murmured. "Not to survive, but for taste." He shook his head slowly. How strange. Their coffees arrived, steaming, rich, with a faint sweetness that drifted from the cup like a familiar embrace. They lifted the lids, letting the warmth touch their faces. And suddenly, the edges of their memories softened. They thought of the guards who had spoken gently to them, the farmers who had offered spare bread, the Canadians who had never treated them as enemies even when the world insisted they should. Years later, the confusion remained. Why were we treated so kindly? As they stood near the window with their coffees, watching the line outside grow longer, one man whispered, "We thought Canadians were starving like Europe." His friend finished the thought quietly. "We did not understand that peace feels different here." He took a sip, eyes closing. "We were prisoners, but Canada fed us." A moment passed, not loud, not dramatic, just three old men letting warmth undo something frozen long ago. And before we continue, wherever you are watching from right now, tell us your country and your current time in the comments. It always amazes us how far these stories travel, how memory and history move across borders just as these men once did. And if this journey is pulling you in, if you want more forgotten chapters like this one, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more lost stories back into the light. Now the three men step deeper into the cafe, and something unexpected, something far more emotional, waits for them just beyond the next table, where the past and present will meet in a way they never imagined. The warmth of the Tim Hortons cafe settled into their bones like something they had forgotten existed, not the heat itself, but the feeling of being welcome, of being allowed to take up space without suspicion. The three men stood near the window for a while, hands wrapped around their cups, watching the steady flow of customers, each one moving with a casual, unburdened confidence that felt almost surreal. One of the former POWs lifted his cup a little higher and inhaled. The scent touched a fragile place inside him, a memory stored beneath years of silence. He saw snow. He saw frost clinging to the eaves of wooden barracks. He saw prisoners in thin coats standing in long lines, stamping their feet to keep blood in their toes, waiting for the soup kettle to roll in on squeaking wheels. He remembered gripping a tin bowl with hands stiff from cold, the steam rising from the ladle like a promise that would carry him through another night. Hunger had been manageable. Fear had been manageable. The unknown had not. But Canada, somehow, had softened the unknown. He spoke without realizing it. "The first winter. I thought we would die." His friend nodded, swallowing as he leaned closer. "We all thought that." The youngest of the three, young only in comparison, added quietly, "And then the farmers came." The cashier overheard and paused mid-motion, curious but careful not to intrude. The volunteer encouraged him softly. "What farmers?" The men exchanged looks, not embarrassed, but searching for the right words. Eventually one began, his voice thick with memory. "The local farmers near the camp," he said. "They brought bread, vegetables, sometimes apples. They left them near the fence. We didn't understand why. There had been no orders for them to do it. No obligation. No propaganda. Just kindness from people who saw hungry young men, enemy soldiers, yes, but still young men far from home." He continued. "One morning, the guards discovered what the farmers were doing. We thought they would punish us." His friend let out a breathy laugh, almost disbelieving even now. But instead, they punished the guards for not telling them sooner. The cashier's eyes widened. "Why?" The man shrugged, emotion rising in his face. "Because the farmers said their cows had more than they needed. Because they said no one should go hungry in the winter. Not even us." Outside the cafe window, a car backed out of a parking spot. A father lifted his child from a booster seat, kissed his cheek, and carried him inside. The sight cracked something open in the men's chests. They watched the simple gesture, the tenderness so casual yet so powerful. One whispered, "In the war, we forgot that people could still be gentle." The bus driver entered the cafe and waved them toward a table reserved for the group. As they sat, the room's bright light seemed to shift around them, and the present melted into a darker memory. They were back in the camp. Back in the isolation of a world that expected hatred and cruelty, yet instead offered a kind of humanity they never anticipated. One of the men remembered the first time he saw a Canadian guard kneel beside an injured POW, lifting him gently after he slipped on the ice. Another remembered learning English from a guard who didn't treat it as a transaction but as a favor between two young men who might have been friends in another life. And then there was the spring planting, the moment that had stayed with all three of them. The camp commander had organized work teams to help on nearby farms, not as forced labor but as an exchange. The farmers fed them lunch, sometimes fresh milk, sometimes meat from the previous night's stew. The POWs were stunned. It was the first time many of them had tasted meat in months. One of the men sat back in his cafe chair now, staring into the swirl of cream dissolving into his coffee. "The farmers treated us better than our own officers did," he said quietly. His voice didn't carry bitterness, only truth. War had forced them into roles they did not choose. Canada had shown them those roles did not have to define them. He took another sip, the heat touching his throat, warming places long cold. "And after the war," he continued, "I wanted to come back. I knew I had to come back. Not because I was forced, but because something here, something human, stayed with me." A local couple at the next table overheard him. They exchanged a look of surprise. Then the woman leaned over with a polite smile. "My grandfather worked near one of those camps," she said. "He said the Germans were hard workers. He never forgot that." The men smiled shyly, touched by the unexpected kindness. One replied softly, "We never forgot your country." Their coffees cooled, but none of them cared. They sat there as if caught between times, the war they survived and the peace they never expected to witness again. The volunteer checked her watch and told them the schedule called for them to continue to the old campsite soon. But the men weren't ready to leave. Something held them there, as if this cafe, this ordinary slice of Canadian life, was a doorway between their past and their present. The youngest spoke again, his voice trembling. "I remember when a guard told me, 'You're safe here. We don't treat prisoners like animals.'" He closed his eyes. "I didn't believe him. Not at first." Another added, "We thought it was a trick." The third said nothing at all, he simply touched his chest, right where the ache lived. The ache of remembering kindness when he expected cruelty. Outside, the line at Tim Hortons finally began to shrink as the morning rush settled. Families carried boxes of donuts to their cars, workers hurried back to job sites, students strolled away with iced coffees. Life moved on with the steady assurance of a country that had never known hunger in the way Europe once had. Yet inside the cafe, time felt suspended as the three men took in every detail, the warmth, the abundance, the easy laughter, the lack of fear. One of them whispered, barely audible, "If only we had known back then, that this was the real Canada." He lowered his gaze. "We spent years thinking Canadians lined up for food because they were starving." The volunteer touched his shoulder gently. "No," she said. "Canadians line up for coffee because, well, they just really like coffee." The man let out a laugh, sudden, quiet, genuine. A release he didn't know he needed. They finished their cups slowly, not wanting the moment to end. Outside, the bus waited to take them to the place where everything began. The past was calling them again, and they would answer. Now the road would carry them toward the remnants of the old camp, where memory and reality would collide once more, in ways they had not prepared for. The bus rumbled back onto the highway, leaving behind the warm glow of the cafe and merging once more into long stretches of quiet countryside. Frost still clung to the edges of the fields, glittering like shards of glass under the thin sunlight. The three former POWs sat near the window again, their expressions softer now but heavy with anticipation. The volunteer had told them they were less than 20 minutes from their destination, the site of the old prisoner of war camp they had not seen since 1945. 8 decades of life had passed between then and now, decades filled with families, careers, fears they never spoke aloud, and memories they never invited into conversation. But as the bus neared the final turn, something in their posture began to change. Their hands tightened slightly. Their eyes sharpened with an almost painful awareness. The landscape here was not merely scenery. It was memory. The road curved around a cluster of trees, and suddenly the forest opened into a wide clearing. The ground lay flat and pale beneath the November sky. A small wooden sign marked the entrance, "Historic Site, Camp 32." The bus slowed to a gentle stop. For a few seconds, no one moved. The air inside felt suspended, as if the past were pressing its ear to the door, waiting to be invited in. When they finally disembarked, the cold air met their faces with a familiar bite, the kind of sharpness they remembered from mornings when they stood roll call in thin coats, breath rising like fog against the dawn. The clearing looked different now, of course. The barracks were gone. The watchtowers gone. The fences long since dismantled. In their place stood informational plaques, a few preserved foundations, and an open sky too bright and too peaceful to match their memories. But the shape of the land had not changed. Memory filled in what time had erased. One of the men stepped forward slowly, boots crunching over gravel. His eyes scanned the clearing, and his breath caught as he whispered, "It was here. Right here." He walked a few more paces, stopping on a patch of frost-bitten grass. "My barrack stood here." His companions followed, each gravitating toward the places their bodies somehow still remembered, where the dining hall once stood, where the guard's hut had been, where they had played improvised soccer matches to pass the long afternoons. What surprised them was not how much had changed, but how much their minds had preserved with perfect clarity. The volunteer gave them space, letting them drift into their own recollections. One of the men reached out and touched the foundation stones of the old mess hall. The stones were cold, but the moment they met his fingertips, a warmth bloomed inside his chest, not comfortable warmth, but the burning of emotion long suppressed. He saw himself at 19 again, shivering as he waited for the next ladle of soup, clutching a wooden bowl that once belonged to another prisoner who hadn't survived the Eastern Front before being transferred here for recovery. He remembered how he sat next to a Canadian guard who pushed half of his bread toward him, pretending it was by mistake. He hadn't understood why. Not fully. Not then. Further along the clearing, another of the former POWs stood with his eyes closed, listening. The wind rustled through the trees in a way that brought back a sound he hadn't heard in 80 years, the rhythmic thud of boots on frozen ground during morning exercises. He remembered looking at the faces of the guards, expecting hostility, but seeing something else instead. Some were stern, yes, but many were simply human, tired, cold, trying to do their duty without cruelty. He remembered the first time one of them asked, "How's your family in Germany?" He didn't know how to answer then. He barely knew how to answer now. The third man stayed near the entrance for a long moment, staring at the entire clearing as if trying to connect two overlapping worlds, the one before him and the shadow version superimposed by memory. When he finally walked toward the center, he stopped suddenly, eyes wide. "This was the infirmary," he murmured. "I came here with frostbite." His voice trembled. "The doctor, he treated me like I was his own son." He bowed his head. "I don't know why." The volunteer approached gently. "Because here, you were people," she said softly. "Not prisoners." The man nodded slowly, tears forming along his lashes. He didn't wipe them away. A wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of pine and old earth. The men stood scattered across the clearing, each anchored in his own ghosts, until the volunteer called from the path above. "There's more," she said. "Something you might want to see." They followed her to a small building the Historical Society had constructed, part museum, part memorial. As they entered, warm air greeted them along with the faint smell of aged wood. The first display case held artifacts found during excavation. Buttons, fragments of old boots, spoons with initials carved into them, handmade playing cards, a metal harmonica rusted with time. One of the men pressed a hand to the glass. "We used to play that," he whispered. "Every evening, to forget we were prisoners." Farther inside, the walls displayed photographs, black and white images of POWs smiling as they built fences, harvested crops, shoveled snow, played soccer, carved wooden toys. The men stared at the faces, each one familiar like a distant cousin glimpsed at a funeral. "These were our friends," one said, voice cracking. "We never saw them again after repatriation." Then the volunteer guided them to the final room, a quiet chamber with soft lighting and a single bench. Along the wall, a painted timeline described the gradual evolution of the camp, the humane treatment of prisoners, the integration with local farms, and the surprising kindness extended by Canadian civilians. The last panel showed something unexpected: letters. Dozens of them. From former POWs who had returned to Canada decades later with gratitude and affection. Several contained phrases that mirrored their own stories. "Canada showed us humanity, your country changed my life. I came back because I couldn't forget the kindness." One of the men traced the letters with his eyes, then whispered, "We weren't alone." The realization hit him with the force of a collapsing dam. There were many like us. The museum guide approached quietly and said, "Some of them settled here after the war. Some married Canadians. Some never went back." She paused, then added, "Not because they were forced. Because they felt safe." The three men exchanged a long, silent look, not sad, not bitter, but overwhelmed by the echo of their own memories reflected in the stories around them. They stepped back outside into the cold air, and something in the clearing looked different now. The land was no longer a place of captivity. It was a place of transformation, where fear had softened, where strangers had shown humanity, where boys had become men who carried the memory of kindness across a lifetime. Ahead, the volunteer gestured toward the far end of the clearing. "There's one last place," she said, "where everything changed." And so they walked, hearts heavy and full, toward the spot that defined their time in Canada, the place where war met compassion in the most unexpected way. They followed the volunteer down a narrow trail lined with brittle grass and wind-beaten pines. The sky had begun to dim into early evening, turning the horizon a soft bruised purple. The men walked slowly, not because of age, but because every step felt weighted with something deeper, the gravity of recognition. Ahead, the trail curved and opened into another clearing, smaller than the first, edged by the outline of frost-softened stones. To an outsider, it looked like nothing more than a quiet patch of land, but to these former POWs, it was the center of everything they had not spoken for 80 years. One of the men stopped first, breath catching in his throat. "My God," he whispered. "It's the field." His voice trembled, neither fear nor nostalgia, but the strange collision of both. He reached for the support of a nearby tree, steadying himself as images from 1945 rushed back with terrifying clarity. The snowstorm, the crash of metal, the frantic shouts of guards, and the realization, the moment that rewrote his understanding of enemy, ally, and humanity. The other two men arrived at his side, and each seemed to freeze in place. This was where it happened, the incident that none of them had dared to describe for decades, not to their wives, not to their children, not to themselves except in sleepless nights when memory pressed too heavily on their chest. The volunteer watched them carefully, noticing how their faces shifted with the expression of someone seeing two timelines at once. One living, one ghostly. "You can take your time," she said gently. But time had already undone itself. The moment was unfolding again in their minds whether they wanted it to or not. 8 decades earlier, the field was a different world, barren, icy, brutal. A supply truck had overturned on the icy road, rolling toward a group of prisoners working under guard. The truck carried fuel barrels, and as it skidded and slammed onto its side, flames burst into a roaring inferno. The prisoners closest to the wreck scattered for safety, slipping across the frost as burning debris flew into the air. The guards shouted orders, but their voices drowned beneath the crackle of fire and the growing panic. The wind changed suddenly, pushing the flames toward the barracks, directly toward the thin wooden walls where dozens of prisoners were inside resting after labor duty. The three men standing there now had been among those trapped between fire and fence, their escape route cut in 2 directions. They remembered the heat on their faces, the taste of smoke, the way the flames reflected in their frozen tears. "We thought we were done," one murmured now, barely audible. "There was no way out." He swallowed. "We thought the guards would abandon us. That's what we were told, back home. That enemies wouldn't save us." But the memory continued, and it tangled with something unexpected, something that changed everything. Because the guards didn't run. They rushed forward. It happened so fast that none of the POWs could understand it at the time. 3 Canadian guards sprinted into the path of the spreading fire, their coats thrown aside, boots sinking into slush and ash. 2 of them grabbed shovels from the fence line and began carving trenches to slow the flames. Another ran toward the barracks, kicking open the door and shouting for the prisoners inside to evacuate immediately. The fire roared against the wind, sending sparks whipping into the cold air like furious embers trying to devour the world. And against that impossible scene, the Canadians fought. One of the POWs, the oldest of the 3 now, closed his eyes as he relived it. He remembered staring at the guard who dragged him by the collar away from the advancing flames. Los Raus, the Canadian had yelled, using broken German so the prisoners would understand. This guard didn't know his name, didn't know his story, didn't know whether he had family back home. But he saved him anyway, pulled him to safety, shielded him with his own body from a blast of heat when one of the fuel drums erupted. I never forgot his face, the old man whispered now in the clearing. Not one day. His voice cracked. And I never understood why he saved me. The volunteer stepped closer. Because he didn't see an enemy, she said softly. He saw a life in danger. The old man nodded slowly, his throat too tight for words. The other 2 POWs recalled their own moments. One had helped the guards carry buckets of sand, desperate to stop the flames before they reached the barracks. He remembered fumbling with the handle, hands numb and shaking, and how a Canadian guard grabbed the other side without hesitation. They worked together, enemy and captor, no longer divided by uniform or war, but united by survival. The 3rd remembered something else entirely. After the fire was finally beaten back, after hours of fighting the flames and tearing apart smoldering debris, one of the guards collapsed from exhaustion. A prisoner, a German soldier who had been taught since childhood to hate anyone in Allied uniform, lifted the guard onto his own shoulder and carried him into the cold night air. In that moment, the war cracked open. Its narrative no longer made sense. Now, standing in the quiet clearing where that chaos once erupted, the 3 men found themselves overwhelmed not by the memory of fire, but by the memory of mercy. This, one whispered, is where I stopped believing what we were told. His companions nodded. This is where I realized the world was not what we thought. The evening wind moved through the trees again, and the clearing felt sacred, like a place where something profoundly human had once unfolded. The volunteer, watching the emotion build in their faces, spoke gently. This is why many POWs later wrote letters saying Canada changed them. Why some returned. Why some never left. The men remained silent, absorbing the truth they had always known but never spoken. Finally, one turned toward her. There's one thing I never understood, he said. After that day, no one punished us. No one treated us differently. They didn't expect gratitude. They didn't expect anything. The volunteer nodded. They didn't do it for reward, she said. They did it because it was right. The men stood quietly for a long moment, letting the memory settle like falling ash, softening into something they could finally hold without fear. The clearing around them felt warmer now, not in temperature, but in recognition, as if the land itself remembered the night it held both terror and kindness. And as the shadows lengthened across the field, they realized they were ready to face one more part of the past, the one that came after the fire, after the rescue, after the night that changed everything. The day they left Canada, and the reason so many, like them, wanted to return. The sun hovered low as they walked back from the clearing where the fire had once raged, casting long shadows over the quiet land. The past clung to them like a second skin, familiar yet impossibly distant. And still, as the bus idled softly on the gravel road waiting to take them to their final stop, they hesitated. There was one last chapter of their story they had never fully faced, not the moment they arrived in Canada, frightened and conditioned by propaganda, nor the night the guards pulled them from the jaws of an inferno. It was the day they left. The morning they stood in lines, duffel bags at their feet, staring at the Canadian countryside for the last time, unsure of the world waiting beyond the ocean. They remembered it too clearly. The sense of being pulled in 2 directions, one toward a ruined homeland they no longer recognized, the other toward a country that had shown them a vision of humanity they did not yet know how to speak about. As they stepped onto the bus now, that old heaviness returned, soft, but unmistakable. The road dipped toward the river valley, where the Historical Society had restored one of the old rail platforms used for repatriation in 1946. Only a few planks remained original, worn smooth by the weight of thousands of men boarding trains that would take them to Halifax and then across the Atlantic to a Germany still smoldering in defeat. When the former POWs reached the platform, they stopped in silence. The wind blew gently across the open space, carrying the faint smell of pine and cold river water. It was almost unbearably peaceful. And yet, in their minds, the platform was alive again with the clatter of boots, the anxious murmurs of men uncertain of their future, and the quiet motions of Canadian guards helping them load their belongings. "It was the first time," one of the men murmured, "that I didn't want to go home." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Back then, the repatriation orders had come suddenly. Many German POWs were shocked. They had been treated better in captivity than they expected to be treated in their own country. Some had steady work on farms. Some attended classes. Some formed friendships with Canadian civilians through labor projects and holiday meals. And some, far more than German authorities ever admitted, fell in love with the land itself. Its open skies. Its quietness. Its dignity. For these young men raised under relentless ideology and harsh discipline, Canada had been the first place where they felt like people rather than instruments of a state. And leaving that behind felt like a second exile. One of the men on the platform remembered the exact moment he had boarded the train. A Canadian guard, the same one who saved him from the fire, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Good luck to you, lad. And don't forget, you're welcome here again one day." The young German had nodded, barely able to speak. At 19, he didn't understand how much those words would shape his life. He only knew they felt heavier than his duffel bag and warmer than the coat on his back. Standing on the same platform now, at nearly 100 years old, the memory struck him with overwhelming clarity. He whispered, "I never forgot." Another remembered the ride through the countryside as the train pulled away. German prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, not to observe the guards but to memorize the land they feared they would never see again. They watched farms slip by, places where they had worked alongside Canadian families, where they had learned to chop wood, milk cows, harvest potatoes, mend fences, laugh at jokes they barely understood. Some had been invited into homes for Christmas dinners, handed steaming plates of roast turkey and mashed potatoes by strangers who treated them with kindness. These memories stayed with them long after the war, forming the foundation of a loyalty they never expected, a loyalty not to a nation's politics, but to its people. The men on the platform now sat on one of the benches, staring out across the valley. One spoke softly, almost to himself. "When we arrived in Germany, everything was gone." He paused, eyes glistening. Cities destroyed. Families scattered. Factories silent. And we came back not as heroes, but as reminders of defeat. There was no bitterness in his voice, only the weight of lived truth. "But what we brought with us," he continued, "was something Germany desperately needed then. Hope. Compassion. The idea that the world could be kinder than we were taught." The others nodded. They remembered how, after the war, when they applied for citizenship in Canada years later, immigration officials were stunned by the numbers. Thousands of former POWs returned, not because they needed a place to escape, but because they wanted to build a life in the place that had shown them an alternative to hatred. Many became farmers, mechanics, carpenters. Some married Canadian women. Some raised children who never knew their fathers had once worn German uniforms. And almost all kept one particular memory locked away, not the hardships, but the kindnesses that saved them. Standing by the rail line now, the volunteer asked them gently, "Why did you want to come back today?" The oldest man answered slowly, choosing each word as if it were fragile. "Because this was where I stopped being a prisoner." He looked across the valley. Not when the war ended. Not when the gates opened. But here, when someone who didn't have to care, cared. Another added quietly, "Because we needed to say thank you. Even after all this time." The light began to fade, and the river turned gold under the falling sun. A hush settled over the group. It felt as though the land itself was listening, as though the echoes of the past, the trucks, the guards, the shouts, the laughter, the fire, were blending into the calm of the present. And for the first time in decades, the three men finally felt something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel before: closure. As they turned to leave, one of them looked back a final time at the platform. "If we had not been captured," he said softly, "we might never have learned what humanity could look like." Another nodded. "War took everything from us," he murmured. "Canada gave something back." They walked toward the bus with slow, deliberate steps, not because they were frail, but because they understood the weight of what they were leaving behind. The place that had changed their lives, shaped their futures, and offered them a truth they carried into old age, that even in war, kindness can rewrite a man's destiny. And as the bus pulled away into the fading twilight, the clearing behind them remained silent and eternal, a witness to the unlikely friendship between former enemies and the country that refused to treat them as such.